for climate. Lastly, this is an on-the-record conversation as we're recording it to share with members or CEOs or others who missed this conversation and want to listen in. From the beginning of this effort, we've known that we can't wait for the perfect or the ideal to move forward or our organizations to change immediately the way they want. We must act on what we know and what we learn about and what we don't know. And it's with that sort of courage that each of us came forward in the drafting and the implementation of the compact, which you are leading and shaping. And I thank you all for that. So I'm really excited to turn it over to Noam Unger, Lindsey Doyle, and then to Manish Bapna, and to hopefully spur what will be an interesting conversation on the early wins of our community and what inspires them and some of the challenges we face going ahead. So again, thank you for joining, and over to you, Noam. We can't hear you if you're, there you are. Noam can't hear you. I don't know if you need head. Yeah, we're missing. We've lost your audio for some reason. Something plugged in. You're off mute. You were off mute, but you lost your audio. So if you use a headset. So stand by. We'll deal with the age of Zoom and technical difficulties. Thank you for your patience. Maybe one thing to mention, we've had a hurricane hitting down, Zeta hitting, we've had power loss in North Carolina. I think we have buckets of rain coming down here in the DC area. So I think certain places along the Gulf Coast have had 3 hurricanes in 2 months. If anything, this is a clear indication, as we know the scientists are telling us, of what we're having to live through. So Noam, you're back, and see if we can hear you. We got you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, good. I apologize. Right before this call started, my entire electricity and internet went out, and it came back on, and it seems to have affected my microphone. All right, so thanks, Sam. Happy to have this opportunity to share where we've been and where we're headed. So let's go into the next slide. We've been accelerating Interaction's climate work. A year ago in September, we initially brought the idea of our climate initiative to our board of directors. Then in November of last year, we hosted a workshop with many of your staff to begin to build the case for why climate change matters for relief and development globally. Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland, joined us and has been an amazing ally to these efforts, given her leadership globally on climate justice. Between January and March of this year, of 2020, more than 40 member organizations were involved in crafting the text of the NGO Climate Compact. And despite happening just as the COVID-19 pandemic was hitting the US with full force, on April 22nd, the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, we launched the NGO Climate Compact with a digital campaign that featured 22 CEOs of Interaction members pledging their commitment, and a great event. The overall campaign involved 700 people across our sector, and as a community, we reached 4 million Twitter and Facebook users on that day alone. The NGOs that signed on and made commitments through the NGO Climate Compact did so in 4 key areas from now until the end of 2022. 1, to educate stakeholders and advocate for public policy change. 2, to mainstream climate and environmental considerations into all programs. 3, to reduce our own carbon footprint and waste as organizations. And 4, to learn, to not absolve ourselves of responsibility simply because we don't know yet. So a learning agenda exists across our community on this issue. These 4 areas of a commitment are intended to jumpstart sometimes difficult conversations that drive action. From there, we established 3 new climate working groups aligned with those commitments. These groups have had 170 staff from 52 NGOs actively involved, and each meet every 4 to 6 weeks to advance priorities. These working groups have already hosted 9 learning events in under 5 months and are currently engaging in strategic planning for the new year with significant member input. To support members, we also established and continue to collate a climate and environment resource library that contains more than 60 trainings and toolkits and campaigns and things of that sort as a resource. We also launched a monthly climate digest to reach 300 staff and executives involved in implementation across Interaction membership. That has opportunities for engagement, upcoming events, reports, and multimedia on climate within our sector. And on top of all of those activities, we conducted a member survey of all signatories. And I'll turn it over to Lindsey Doyle, the manager of our climate work, to talk about that. Over to you, Lindsey.
Thanks, Noam. To track our own progress as both an organization and a coalition, we created a monitoring plan with specific goals and outcomes that we seek to achieve. In June, we ran a survey of all organizations that signed. And we did this, first of all, to capture a baseline of coalition level information about progress toward the 4 areas of commitment, as well as to gauge members' level of interest in opportunities to address climate change and inform our own internal planning in terms of opportunities that we offered. The survey sampled 84 organizations, and we had 36 respond, resulting in a 43% response rate. We also accounted for selection effects, so can reasonably apply our findings from the responses to the full group of signatories. Next slide. Given what we learned from the pledge to action on preventing sexual exploitation and abuse as a kind of way to galvanize the community, one of the key areas that we were curious about was what effect, if any, the NGO Climate Compact had on those organizations that signed. We found that between April and June of this year, 50% of signatories had made internal changes as a result of signing the NGO Climate Compact. In an open-ended way, we also asked organizations about the types of changes that they made as a result of those deliberations. And we coded these responses after the fact to get a sense of the frequency of each. We found that among NGOs that made changes, they most frequently integrated the principles and commitments of the Climate Compact into their new or ongoing internal planning and policy development. The next most commonly cited change was spurring staff dialogue, communication, and internal evaluations. In the survey, we also asked organizations to rate their own level of progress on a range of actions that would begin to indicate change in all 4 of the commitment areas. And the first we explored was around climate education and advocacy. This graph shows the weighted averages of all responses on a 5-point Likert scale. And you'll see that the answer choices ranged from will not pursue to has completed, with the option to say, I don't know, which was excluded from those averages. We measured it this way to be able to watch change over time when we repeat the survey each year. Progress on each of these actions is listed in ascending order so that actions at the top have the least amount of collective member progress, and those at the bottom have the most. The categorization at the bottom indicates the general phase that signatories are in. Signatories are, on average, taking actions to enhance their own learning and communication internally and externally, yet are still in the exploratory phase when it comes to advocating toward US government, multilateral institutions, or donors related to climate. Next slide. We also asked respondents to rate their progress toward climate mainstreaming in programs. The area where organizations reported the most progress was in soliciting funding or implementing climate or environment-specific programming. They also self-reported exploring how climate change affects beneficiaries and programs that were not necessarily fully focused on the environment. The third commitment area is on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and waste within NGO operations. And here we found that staff-led volunteer sustainability teams were quite common as a kind of jumping off point to get that work started, as was the development of organization-wide policies, plans, or principles related to climate. The last category that we surveyed was around learning, and this is cross-cutting, so applies to all the previous 3 commitments we described. We found that signatories were on average already learning from experts and innovators on ways to address climate change, as well as in the exploratory phase of conducting original research on new or more effective approaches to address the issue. So with that, Noam, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Thank you. To wrap up, we wanted to share a few examples of opportunities for all of you and your staff in the remainder of 2020, even though there isn't much time left in this year, and into 2021. So if we could go to the next slide. The first area is the Climate Advocacy Working Group, where members will be engaging congressional offices in November and December to touch base with existing champions on climate, and in January and February to meet freshman members of Congress. This working group will also be engaging in planning for COP26, the next gathering of member states to the UN Paris Climate Agreement in November of 2021, as well as learning opportunities around green debt relief to enable a sustainable recovery from COVID-19 globally. In the Climate Mainstreaming Working Group, members are sharing and learning about innovations in climate resilience and how to meaningfully integrate climate considerations at both strategic and programmatic levels. Some NGOs are developing climate strategies or determining how to integrate it into existing organizational goals. Opportunities are forthcoming for humanitarian members to shape the International Federation of the Red Cross and ICRC's recent efforts on climate. In the area of sustainability within our organizations, Interaction has forged partnerships with organizations such as World Resources Institute and alliances of other NGOs doing similar work to support members to fast track their baseline carbon footprint studies, finishing them at low cost in under 4 months. The Environmental Sustainability Working Group is also exploring the creation of an NGO guide to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in operations and programs that ensures that NGOs can continue to fulfill their missions. Members are also exploring NGO implemented carbon sequestration projects and shared lessons learned. So all of the work on sustainability is important to ensure that we're not just talking the talk, but that we're organizationally walking the walk as well. And if you go to the last slide, I just wanted to say that you know, there are these different ways to get involved. Everyone should be looking for ways to sort of deepen engagement given our collective commitments. Before introducing Manish for the next section, I do want to thank several Interaction team members who make this work possible, including Lindsey Doyle, who you just heard from, as well as Sarah Nitz-Nolan, Kelsey Harris, Jenny Marin, Lisa Pena, Julian Shop, Hilmi Mohammed, Carolyn Abbey, Michelle Neal, Jeremy Dorman, Morgan Martinez, and Justin Millar. As you can tell, it takes a village, and Interaction is very committed to this agenda, drawing on all parts of our team and staff. So let me now turn back to, or over to Manish, who's going to be facilitating our fireside chat with our speakers today. Manish Bapna is the Executive Vice President and Managing Director of the World Resources Institute, a global research organization that works to address the urgent sustainability challenges related to food, forests, water, climate, energy, cities, and the ocean. Manish oversees WRI's programs. He chairs WRI's management team and works to strengthen the impact of WRI research. And he's not new to the Interaction community. He knows us very well. Prior to WRI, Manish was executive director of the nonprofit Bank Information Center, and one of Interaction's members. And he has served as a senior economist and task team leader at the World Bank. And I know he's been on the boards of organizations within our membership, including Oxfam. So let me turn it over to you, Manish.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Noam. And quite a timely moment for this conversation, Sam. I was struck by your comment about the kind of weather we're experiencing here on the East Coast. It's quite interesting today. Today, actually 8 years ago in 2012, was when Hurricane Sandy struck the east coast of the United States. It was 21 years ago, 1991, when a major cyclone, tropical cyclone, hit Odisha in India. And I actually remember because I was in India at the time. And even today is the day that the International Red Cross was founded. So bringing this conversation about climate, major natural disasters, and relief and development seems like a timely moment for this conversation. And couldn't be more pleased that we have two terrific leaders from the climate movement, Aneesa Khan, who's executive coordinator of SustainUS, and Elan Strait, who's the co-founder of We Are Still In, and the former National Security NSC Director for Climate and Clean Energy in the White House with us today. And so what we thought we would do, I would take about, let's say about 25 minutes or so and engage in a little bit of a coffee-side chat with the two of them, but then we clearly want to open it up to all of you to broaden the discussion. And I was going to organize the kind of conversation along kind of three rough buckets of questions. The first is a little bit around Aneesa and Elan and kind of what motivates them around climate, a little bit about their organization. Then I thought we would turn to politics because we must. And then I thought we would talk a little bit about the climate movement, what's working, what's not, and where we need to go. And so maybe I'll start a little bit, and I'll start maybe with you, Aneesa, just to say a few words about what motivates you to work on climate, but also tell us about SustainUS. What does it do? What excites you about it? What are its future kind of vision and strategy?
Yeah, definitely. Hi, everyone. My name is Aneesa Khan, and I am really excited to be here with all of you. I am the executive coordinator for SustainUS, which is a youth-led organization where we know in our blood and bones that our futures are being put at risk by the systemic injustice of climate change. And SustainUS is a community of young people between the ages of 18 and 29 from really diverse geographies and identities across the US. So Indigenous youth from the Navajo Nation to young people living in American coal country to those on the front lines of the fires that are burning down the West Coast every year. And we train each other in mobilizations, media, and solidarity organizing skills so that we can work together for climate justice. And we've been around for about 20 years now because we really believe that young people facing the climate crisis deserve an international voice and an opportunity to really deeply collaborate with allies and elders who have been working for climate justice around the world for many more years than we have. And so we've been giving young people a platform to do this by giving them access to international climate spaces like the UN climate conferences or the World Bank meetings. And we've come a long way. I think that, just to give some context, historically, SustainUS was very much a policy-focused organization where young people were being taken to the UN, to kind of see how policy is made and to intervene in some ways. But right now, where we're at is that we really recognize that those who are on the front lines of crisis are the forefront of change. So SustainUS is currently now an organization that I'd say is, 95% young people from Black, Brown, Indigenous communities who are on the front lines of the climate crisis in the US. And that is kind of the place from where we organize that these young people are leaders in their communities and leaders in SustainUS as well. Just quickly, a little bit more about myself and what inspires me to be here. So I was born in India and I was raised in Oman in the Middle East, and it was a wild experience. It was a country where about 80% of the economy was based on the fossil fuel industry, and oil was 10 times cheaper than drinking water. And, when I was 17, I moved to the US for college, and I moved to Maine, which was a big difference in temperature from the Middle East. And while I was there, I started, learning about climate justice and attending the UN climate conferences with lots of other young activists every year since 2014, actually. And, just as a little example, at SustainUS, we call ourselves creative storytellers, and that's how we do our work. When the Paris Climate Agreement was being made, I was actually there in the room and watching it being gabbled through. And I remember, you know, it was the 12th of December and everyone was talking about how it was the deal to save us all. And a lot of people put faith into the process as, you know, a monumental success for the planet and its people. And at the same time, we're seeing today, right, that the agreement that says, you know, 1.5 degrees of warming is a tipping point for frontline communities. It's also the same agreement to which, you know, countries have made commitments that are taking us to a world that's 4 degrees warmer by the end of the century. And so having a civilized world at that point felt very unreasonable. And as I was watching, you know, my future and the rest of the world be negotiated in front of me, a really devastating hurricane and freak floods ravaged the town in India that my parents live in and have, you know, currently live in as well, in Chennai. And 300 people died, and I didn't hear from anyone I knew for, you know, 2 entire days. And I think seeing my family as a frontline community was something I didn't want to confront, but ended up confronting. And I think that that's really what brings me into this work, is that the inconvenient truth is no longer climate change itself. It's the fact that it comes at the cost of real lives and real people and their futures. And that's also why I'm in SustainUS. We're an organization of young people who are showing up for their families, for their communities, and working together and amplifying each other's skills to build a world that we all believe in.
Thank you, Aneesa. That was incredibly powerful, and I really like that quote. You know, those that are on the forefront of the crisis are at the forefront of change, and I think that's absolutely true. But something, quite frankly, that the climate movement hasn't been very good at actually making happen in practice. But I hope that changes in the future. Elan, let me turn to you. Kind of similar question. Kind of, you know, motivation on climate. Tell us a little bit about We're Still In, and if you get a chance, you know, would love to hear. I know you've been following the science quite a bit. Maybe if you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a while since I was included in any demographic where I was thought of as youth anymore. So I'm enjoying this. We were thinking about like, okay, we're going to do a youth engagement strategy. How do we define youth? And somebody said 18 to 25. And I said, how about 18 to 34? And that didn't work. So Aneesa is going to be the real expert on engaging youth for the purpose of these conversations. I'm already seen as old hat in a lot of these climate talks, but my name is Elan. First, I just want to say up front, my day job is at World Wildlife Fund. I'm doing this in my personal capacity, not representing World Wildlife Fund, which would be important when we get to topic 2 on the politics. I came to this issue. I'm actually really glad to be talking to all of you because I came to the issue through a lens of the poverty issues that were going to be exacerbated, that are exacerbated by climate, and the humanitarian crises. And Aneesa's point about what was going on during the Paris negotiations globally really does put into focus, I think, where my motivation personally comes from. And I think, as Manish said, we don't do enough on this topic. So right before the Paris negotiations, there was a terrorist attack in Paris 2 weeks before. And then, as Aneesa said, during the negotiations or right after, it's typhoon and hurricane season in South Central and Southeast Asia. And so what the terrorist attack ended up putting into focus for a lot of people was the way in which there was this growing conflict in France, and a growing, in particular, French nationalist movement that was reacting to an influx of a refugee population coming from Northern Africa in particular. And so this terrorist attack, which had very little to do with the refugee situation, ended up exacerbating a conflict between French nationalists and an immigrant population. And that refugee crisis that was making its way into France and into Greece and into Italy is 100% a result of a climate that is changing in Northern Africa and is no longer or is just not capable of providing stable lives for people in Northern Africa. And at the same time, there were these natural disasters in Asia that for a lot of the negotiators, it's shocking. I was a negotiator for the United States in Paris, and it's shocking how often during the negotiations there will be a natural disaster that pulls a negotiator away from the negotiations, meaning that they have to go home or they have to check in on their family because something is going on at home that is climate caused. It just sort of boggles the mind. We're not talking about an issue that's 30 years on. We're not negotiating about how do we prevent an issue. We're negotiating about how we manage a crisis. And the thing about the climate crisis is it's not one crisis. It is thousands of crises going on at the same time and being made worse by climate change or being caused by climate change. And the true moral issue, and this is where all of your work comes in, the true moral issue of climate isn't that humanity has created a problem and now humanity has to manage it. The moral issue of climate change is that the wealthy on Earth have created this problem, and the least wealthy, the most vulnerable, are going to suffer from it. And this is true not only it's true in the United States. I mean, as Manish said about, and Sam said about the weather events that are impacting the United States, those impacts aren't felt evenly. We know in the United States that not everyone gets to choose where they live. And so you can easily imagine that as the Louisiana coast becomes less and less livable, because of heat waves, because of hurricanes, that those that can move out of the Gulf will move out of the Gulf. They'll live somewhere livable. Those that don't have the resources that are needed to move out of the Gulf will be left behind. And then what is our obligation? That we have now, A, recognized that there's climate change, B, recognize that those individuals are on the front line, and C, there's nothing they individually can do about it. What do we do then? And the reason why I think that's so important from a humanitarian lens is the climate movement has struggled for decades on making the climate change issue real for anyone. One of the most successful mobilization movements up until recently was called 350. It's still called 350. And 350 refers to the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. I can't think of anything less resonant with the average person than describing the crisis in terms of parts per million CO2 as part of the air. We haven't been able to make this real, and our failure to not make it real for people meant that Mother Nature did it for us. The planet made it real, and now we're left with how do we solve this moral issue? And it is no longer a question of what is the right policy, what is the science telling us? It is now a humanitarian issue, and so the true solutions on the climate crisis are about the humanitarian crisis. So it's such an honor to be speaking with all of you and being able to pull more people into the climate movement, because that's really what the issue is.
Elan, could I just come back to you just in a minute? Could you just maybe tell folks a little bit about We're Still In, what it is, and kind of what its vision is? I think that might be of interest to
Sure. So We Are Still In was launched on June 1st, 2017. President Trump announced that he was going to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement. That was the sort of the low point after Aneesa described the high point of people gathering in Paris and trying to save the world. We were truly concerned that because of the structure of the Paris Agreement, where the targets are voluntary, that if the US withdrew, that other countries were going to step back from the agreement. And so what we wanted to do is communicate to the rest of the world that just because the federal government is withdrawing from the US, it doesn't mean Americans are withdrawing from Paris. It doesn't mean Americans are withdrawing from Paris. And so we launched this coalition called We Are Still In, which is a coalition of cities, states, tribes, businesses, universities, healthcare organizations, cultural institutions, and faith groups that have all committed to uphold the Paris Agreement. And we launched with 1,000 signatories, and now we have 4,000, and they're in all 50 states. And as we get into the politics, we can talk a little bit about how that's such an important political movement at this time.
Thank you, Elan. And I think this point that both Aneesa and Elan made about the impacts of climate. Most of you may have seen the report that the World Bank released about 2-3 weeks ago on extreme poverty, where they made the argument that the conflation of COVID-19, climate, and conflict will largely define kind of the conditions around extreme poverty over the coming decade. And the estimates that they have over the coming years and through 2030 of people falling back into extreme poverty just, brings to bear kind of the challenge that these three issues will face, will create for the poor around the world. I want to turn a little bit now to politics, and coming back to you, Aneesa. I'm sure if you have any insights on what's going to happen on Tuesday or in the days that follow, we would be interested. But speculation aside, clearly the two candidates have very different approaches around climate. Any reflections, advice, insights about what should our priorities be if Biden were to win or if Trump were to win, around how we think about continuing to advance action on climate under either scenario?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think as you're saying, it's so unpredictable. I think it's going to sound like I have had a lot of traumatic moments at the UN climate conferences, which is probably true, but I'll also say I was there when Trump got elected in Morocco. And I remember, like similar to now, people were like, oh, there's, well, I guess less this time, but last time people were like, there's no way this, like the Trump is going to win. And I think that especially as a young person, as a young climate justice activist, it was a really heartbreaking moment to realize that, there's two options. Either there's an administration where, you are fighting to defend everything that is currently in place and to make sure that it's, staying okay. And then there's an administration, like the possibility where we can push further to actually, make it more radical, to make it a real possibility for, a livable future. And I think that those are kind of the two choices right now, and they're both hard and both have their own difficulties. One is definitely a lot harder. I think that if, there's a Biden administration, then what we do as a climate justice movement is hold him accountable to the current climate plan that he has. We push it further. We make sure it works for everyone, because welfare policies in the US have a history of marginalizing vulnerable communities even further. If Biden is talking about his climate plan as a version of the Green New Deal, the original New Deal left so many Black communities behind, displaced Indigenous communities, and we have to be thinking about how are these voices being included at the very beginning and through the whole process, and not just included, but leading the process on how policies are made so that they work for their communities. And another part that I really want to talk about with the Biden administration is that we need to remember that a climate plan for the US doesn't mean a successful climate plan for the whole world. Right? Because I think that I can give an example of the term eco-apartheid. Like if we are, building a new green city under a Green New Deal or under a climate plan, there's still a possibility that through, urban planning and zoning laws, only some people get to experience the life in a green, renewable city, and a lot of people are left behind. Like when Katrina was rebuilt, when New Orleans was rebuilt after Katrina, it was like a broken city was rebuilt to be more broken. And so there's that question of, how are we holding a quote unquote progressive government accountable? And then I think with the Trump administration, what we do is what I think communities are doing now, which is that we learn from frontline communities and support them. The solutions that we need are very much amongst us. There are people, besides those working on progressive climate policy, there are communities with kind of on the ground solutions to the climate crisis that already exist. There are people who are, trying to, independent of the federal situation, change what climate justice means and change it so that it reflects their communities. And so I think that the priority areas are, holding if it's a Biden administration, holding them accountable, pushing them forward on it, and making sure that a Biden climate plan is a plan that works for all people, especially those on the front lines of the crisis. And I think if it's a Trump administration, there's not that much pushing you can do. And I think it's a lot more of you take it on and you support the communities that are going to be feeling it the hardest.
Thank you, Aneesa. Elan, same question.
This is what I've been spending the last few weeks doing is I spend too much time for my own sanity thinking about what happens if Trump wins. Let me start with the Biden scenario, as Aneesa did, which is I totally agree that the first thing that the movement should do right after the election, before inauguration, is start talking about inclusive policymaking processes. I just think that's so critically important. And it was, I mean, speaking as somebody that was in the Obama administration, in the previous administration, it was a failure of the previous administration to be as inclusive as possible, especially when it comes to frontline communities and climate. So I think that should be a major policy demand, a major policy ask from the movement, for starters. But just laying out a little bit of what I think is possible in the Biden scenario. So we know that if Biden is elected, we actually know in either case that Congress is going to spend trillions of dollars on stimulus and recovery. The question is that money that's going to be spent on infrastructure, is that going to make the climate crisis worse or better? And I think when you start thinking about that question, you realize that every bill that Congress considers, starting now, from now on, is a climate bill. Whether it's about healthcare, whether it's about housing, whether it's about infrastructure, these things are all related to the climate crisis, and we need to start thinking of them through that lens. Whether it's like each bill needs to have a chapter called climate, or whether it's just we need to be pushing them to consider the climate impacts as it affects the legislation. Every piece of legislation is climate legislation. The question, there's going to be a lot of strategic questions for legislation, but of course the major issue, aside from who wins the presidential election, is who's controlling the Senate. In a McConnell scenario, where McConnell is still the majority leader, where Republicans still hold the Senate, there's not an administration be heavily constrained by what the leader allows on the floor of the Senate, and then the fact that the court is now 6-3. And so both you have a narrow window for legislation, and you have a court that's likely not going to give the administration a lot of running room on executive action, because they're going to view that with a lot of skepticism. And so what can happen in those scenarios is to really focus on appropriation, on the things that have to pass through Congress. So there'll be a budget that'll be passed most likely at the beginning of the Biden administration. And what we should be thinking about is, how does that budget help communities, states, tribes, whomever, adapt and mitigate climate change? That should be the ask, is through the budget, which we know we'll have to pass, are we getting funds in the hands of the people that are going to be able to act on climate? So that's what I would focus in the McConnell scenario on the budget. In the situation in which the Democrats hold the Senate and the House and the White House, it's not clear to me that they're going to get rid of the filibuster. Most of the talk I've seen is not that they'll get rid of the filibuster. And so what we're talking about is a situation in which, if they want to pass climate legislation, they'll do it through reconciliation, which constrains, which allows you to pass something with 50+1 votes, but constrains what you're allowed to do. And so in those cases, one of the things I'm concerned about is that, as a matter of legislation, the thing that has the highest chance of passing is in fact a carbon price, or a tax on carbon, or cap and trade. And the problem with that is it disincentivizes emissions, but it does nothing to address the moral issues associated with climate. It doesn't affect where facilities are. It doesn't affect impacts or adaptation or resilience. And so what would be on all of us is, I think we need to support whatever is going to pass through Congress, but we have to be in a situation in which we're not saying, well, whatever passes through Congress is good enough. I think we need to mobilize to get to 50 votes, but also we need to make sure the administration is thinking about the moral issues. And there are certain things that they can do to support a carbon price, to make sure that that the impacts of climate and that pollution aren't as, that those impacts, and it's not as racist as it currently is. And so I think if you have inclusive policymaking processes, if you have a movement that is constantly raising the issue of inequality, then I think you can make a lot of progress in the Biden administration. In the Trump scenario, what we have to do is it's really about trying to just get around the federal government. It's all about on domestic policy. It's all about state policy. And as much as we've learned about what Washington and Congress is capable of climate, we now have to learn about 50 states and their climate policies and what we can do to move policy in those states. And that's going to take a lot of work on our part, but we're going to have to get really invested in New Mexico state policy and Utah state policy and so on. And so that's where I would focus in the Trump administration.
Great, thank you, Elan. Both of you kind of made a point that just reminded me the last time the U.S. had serious legislation on climate in Congress was in 2009, the Waxman-Markey bill. And I think the reason that in no small part failed and all the postmortems kind of showed was the complete disconnect between kind of the elites and kind of grassroots movements within the environmental community that led to both the design and a lack of political support for that bill. So this point about how we actually engage and involve and ensure that frontline communities are at the forefront of the design of policy, I think is something that we must fix this time around. I want to pose one more question to both of you, just very briefly, and then I want to get really open this up, and we're already getting a number of questions coming through the chat, but I'll call on a number of you in the kind of attending or participating in this panel, share your thoughts, feedbacks, questions. So just in one more minute. So just in 1 minute for each of you, Aneesa and Elan. Last question. Advice for the climate and development community. You know, are there something that we're not doing that we need to be doing, or something that we are doing that we need to stop, right? So what is it? What's new? What's wrong? Any quick advice you would have for us, and then we'll open this up. Aneesa?
Okay, so I would say that the thing to start doing is to work with frontline communities that are holding a lot of solutions now to the climate crisis. I think that there is a need for funding within these places. And I think that, you know, especially big NGOs and this sector has a lot of opportunity to kind of redistribute wealth towards people who are already working on the front lines of the climate crisis. I think that for this sector, continue to build the intersectionality between your work and the climate crisis. Even though the climate crisis is putting us on an unyielding deadline, it's giving us an opportunity to really bring together so many different, you know, strong movements for Indigenous rights, for gender justice, for labor rights, so many different things, because climate change is universal. It's going to affect us all, but it's going to affect the most vulnerable the hardest. And then finally, I would say the thing to stop is the fossil fuel industry. So I think that fossil fuel corporations have had a stranglehold on climate policy making as well for longer than the 24 years that I've been alive. And they've been controlling the fate of billions of people around the world. And, you know, I remember that Shell talked about how they wrote parts of the Paris Agreement. And I think that as long as this kind of, you know, corporate influence exists over our policy making, over where we invest our funds and so many different, you know, aspects of our work, then it's very hard for us to move forward in the climate justice movement. And so I think that's another thing to talk about, is just like divesting and also just how do we stop polluting industries.
Thank you, Aneesa. Same, Elan, what do we start? What do we stop?
Yeah, great. So Manish, what you had said about thinking about what went wrong in the 2009-2010 legislation, I actually think is a useful thing to think about, which is we didn't have a powerful enough movement to, as Aneesa was just describing, push back against the fossil fuel interests. And so what we need to do is think of ourselves as part of one movement for progress. And I think sometimes with NGOs that can be really uncomfortable because it's going to get partisan. And so I think we all need to think about how do we play in this movement in a way that's going to achieve political progress? Because at the end of the day, the gap right now in climate, we know the technologies, we know the policies, we just don't have the political will in place. And so thinking about how your NGO, regardless of your tax status, can be part of a political process in a way that is comfortable, but recognizing it's going to get partisan. We know where the Republican Party is, we know where the Democratic Party is. And so this is the thing that we need to start and stop doing. We need to start thinking of ourselves as political creatures that are pushing for progress. And we need to stop thinking of ourselves as capable of sitting on the sidelines of a political debate. It's just not possible. If we're going to achieve the humanitarian goals we have, we need to have political success in the United States. And so we need to be part of that movement.
Thank you. Thank you both. We're going to want to just now open this up. That was really stimulating, and I think going to be great fodder for this next part, where we'd like to just invite all of you to offer some insights, ask some questions. So please feel free to just, I guess you could either physically raise your hand, I'll try to find you, or you could virtually raise your hand, or you could type in a comment. And I'll probably call on a few of you just to kind of share your questions live, and then we'll go back to the to Aneesa and Elan for their reflections as well. So I will, I don't see any hands at the moment, but I do see a number of comments. So maybe I'll ask Amy, Paul, and Anne, who've all thrown in comments into the chat box, if they just want to maybe just share the comments verbally for those, for everyone in plenary. Amy?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's good to see everyone. Yeah, I had a question for Aneesa, and then a question for both of you. For Aneesa, my question relates to I am so it's really exciting to see what you're doing in the movement, and more importantly, like who's driving it, who's leading the work that you're doing. My question to you was whether or not broadening your alliances with more mainstream environmental groups is going to be a key strategy for you, or do you find that your voice, the voice of the people in your group, need to be a really distinct voice because of who you represent? That's one question for you. And then for both of you, my question was what you would like, how you would like to engage this group of international NGO CEOs who are committed to strengthening climate, their engagement around climate within the organization. Thanks.
I'm going to just take a, if that's okay, I'm going to take just a round of comments, and then I'll come back to Aneesa and Elan, so we can get a few more thoughts on the table. Paul.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks everyone for the discussion. Paul Masick with Chorus International. You know, my question was thinking about the sort of unprecedented bipartisan support we've had for food security. I mean, this year is the 10th anniversary of the Global Food Security Act and Feed the Future. Presumably there's the political will to see that continue. I think food security and food systems are one of the areas where there's a huge amount of impacts on environmental conditions, but it's also one where people at a very personal level in their own households and their communities with regards to their own health connect very intimately with food. And so I wonder if that's not an opportunity to, push an agenda which says that, food systems need to be thought about alongside environmental systems and climate change, and how can we sort of galvanize action around this issue by using the concept of food security and the connections, profound connections that it makes. So I'd welcome thoughts from anyone on the panel. Thank you.
Great question. Would love to hear from Anne, and then I'm going to turn to Sean, and then I'll come back to the two of you. And great when you ask a question, if you could also, just like Paul, just introduce who you are and where you're from, just so the panelists know. Thank you. Anne?
Sorry, trying to. Hi, I'm Ann Kuntz with Relief International. Appreciated all the speakers and the comments. Wondering if, in particular, given the scenarios you played out with the different administrations, since most of us on the call are dealing with humanitarian development work internationally, if you're seeing items that might be included as an opportunity or restricted around climate change in these that we should think about advocating as a group for and sort of our top priority list. Thank you.
Great question. Let me turn to Sean, then we'll come to you, and then I think we might have time for another quick round of questions and comments. Sean?
Thank you, Manish, and thanks to Interaction for having this panel. Really appreciate getting us all together and trying to sway more people to join the compact. I think that's really important. I guess what I'd like to ask the group is, and maybe be a little bit provocative, but why have we in the United States, in my opinion, somewhat failed on the climate agenda? When you look at our colleagues in Latin America and Africa and Oceania and Asia, they seem to get it, and we have somewhat failed. And I'm concerned that the disunity that we have in the country and the language we use is alienated people instead of bringing them to the cause. So how do we unite? How do we address the issues? And Manish, you mentioned 3 of what I consider the 4 C's that are critical. It's COVID, climate, conflict, and competition. And I think we're finding that the resource poor are most badly affected. But you know, we're seeing fires in the United States, we're seeing emergencies. I think we can bring people together and work together on these issues. But I think sometimes we're a little bit too polemic as we move things forward. And so instead of uniting, we're dividing, and it's not helping our coalition. So I just asked the group, because I do think we need polemics, you know, to kind of move us and help us, stimulate us to get to the next level. But have we gone too far, and how can we unite people in this country so that the US plays a greater leadership role, because now we're absent?
So we got some fantastic questions, and I'm going to ask something unfair. I'm going to ask you to answer them quite briefly so we can get a couple more questions in the next 15 minutes. Who would like to start? Aneesa or Elan? Aneesa, would you like to start? Great.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say that, Amy, I answered, I think, your first question in the chat, actually. So I was going to let Elan answer your second question, and then we can move ahead a little bit as well.
Sure. I actually, just in response to the first question, so-called mainstream environmental organizations have created some spaces in the last, well, since they've existed, that are very white saturated spaces that are not welcome to people of color. And so I don't think we should be asking groups like SustainUS or Aneesa in particular, should you be partnering with mainstream green groups? I think we need to be going to those green groups and saying, why aren't you including people of color and youth in your movements? And so I wouldn't put that burden on Aneesa to solve that problem. I would put that burden on the larger white traditional green groups, many of which who have really troubling pasts with white supremacy that need to be recognized. With response to what was the second part of the question, Amy? Sorry.
It was how both of you would like to engage or could see yourselves engaging with this group of international NGOs working in development and humanitarian.
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things that I would love, the first thing that comes to mind is in the Trump scenario. I think we need to get really creative about how non-federal actors can participate internationally with others, with national governments, with non-national governments, et cetera. And so what I would love is to do some creative thinking around what are the kind of fora we can be creating internationally that don't require national governments, like that aren't the United Nations where a bunch of governments are sitting at a table, but do allow for people that are interested in solutions to collaborate across borders.
Great, and so we also had really good questions around the food system, around kind of international aid and climate in the U.S. context, and around how we create unity. So if you want to take one or a couple of those, Aneesa, and then I'll turn back to Elan, and then we can maybe go back to the group.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that, and to answer your question about, international aid, I think that something that I've thought about a lot, especially I think coming from India, a country that does receive aid in terms of, climate projects, that's something that feels really important to me, is that development aid institutions are really putting in the kind of forethought and work into seeing what kind of impact that the projects that they're supporting have. Because, so for example, through carbon offsets, a lot of the time, someone in another, well, someone from a developed country or from an organization might provide aid to a developing country to build a project that technically reduces their emissions, but at the same time might have lots of human rights violations, might displace people in the country receiving aid, et cetera. And so I think it's very important to be thinking about these kind of social injustices and human rights impacts that development aid can have as well, which feels extremely important. And I think talking back to what Elan was saying about, how carbon trading might be something that would pass the easiest, at the same time, it doesn't answer that moral issue. So a question of, should you be paying for it, or like, should you be giving aid to a carbon offset project, I think is something to consider. Because the way I think of it is, carbon trading or carbon offsetting is paying someone on the other end of the world to go to the gym so that you can get in shape. It doesn't actually change you, right? Like, it doesn't change the original situation. And then I think in terms of food security, I think there's a huge intersection between the food justice movement and the climate justice movement. I think that there are a lot of, I think that most farmers and communities based on agriculture are well aware of the impacts that climate change is having on them. Like, I would suggest looking at the work that coalitions like La Via Campesina do, and others who could speak to this a lot better than me, but I think there's definitely a very strong existing connection and existing movements talking about this that could definitely use your support and amplification as well.
Yeah, that was a great answer, Aneesa. The only thing I would add is that in a very U.S. political context, that there are partners to be made in, as Aneesa was saying, in the farming community on the issue of climate. The ways that these issues intersect are often very interesting, and I think, again, not to be a pundit, I think if Iowa in this election, just by way of example, if Iowa in this election goes for Biden, it'll be because Trump closed off trading routes to China for soybeans. They had to store their soybeans in mills because they couldn't ship them overseas. That storage was then flooded, and the soybeans were destroyed because of a 100-year flood along the Mississippi that lasted 9 months. And so you can see how climate, if you're able to point out to people that this is a climate cause, which the press is getting better at but is not great at, that you can see how that can actually shift minds on climate because of its relationship with farmers whose livelihoods depend on a stable climate.
Great. Thank you both. I think we have some more questions coming in. I just wanted to add one very small point on the international aid question. Is, I do think over the next couple of years, both bilateral and multilateral aid is going to be very much focused on understandably relief and recovery efforts from the pandemic. And within the climate community, I think one of the big questions are, as the world thinks about how to support low-income countries in terms of building resilience, how do you build resilience to multiple types of risks? Are there investments that can be looked at that can help build resilience to health shocks, to economic shocks, to climate shocks? How do you deal with both the short-term urgent priorities of today, but still set the world towards a low-carbon resilient future because of the very short window that both Aneesa and Elan have spoken to, that we can't afford not to program that funding in ways that can address these multiple challenges at the same time. So just a really important set of questions. I want to turn to Ed, Ruth.
Wait, sorry, 1 second. Sean asked a question.
Yes, I thought you, please, that would be great. I didn't know.
Said,
yes,
yeah,
yes, please.
Why are we different than every other country? It's very easy, money and politics. That's why. Because the fossil fuel interests have spent so much money trying to shift the balance of politics. That is between us and every other country on earth.
Can I also just add something on that? I feel like the US as a country with the biggest historical responsibility for causing climate change is also very quick to be like, oh no, we don't want to deal with that. So if you think about why the Clinton administration pulled out of Kyoto, it's very much because a big part of that was that, you know, the US was also asked to pay reparations, right, along with other countries that are developed countries in the global north that have historically caused the climate crisis and that have to be, you know, aiding countries in the global south to kind of overcome this crisis. And I think that any kind of differentiation between a country like the US and, let's say, even a country in, you know, like a least developed country was basically rejected. And so I think that that's also part of it. It's that history of not wanting to acknowledge the difference in responsibility.
We probably have more questions than we're going to have time for, but I think it'd be useful just to surface these questions, even if we don't have time to answer them fully. So ask people to be succinct, but if I could turn to Ed and Ruth.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'll just quickly say what I said at length, maybe in the comments section, which is really simply that, so I'm on the IPCC. I'm actually writing the Climate Resilient Development Pathways chapter, literally panic writing it as we speak. And that chapter will very explicitly link development to climate change adaptation and mitigation. It will very explicitly call out the need for transformative change and attention to equity in outcomes. And you got to understand, IPCC is an assessment of the literature. So this is a staggeringly well-established point. And actually, Manish, to your point, we're actually bringing in COVID as an argument for understanding systemic risk that exists in the world and how we have to think about this. So the point I guess I'm making is a lot of what we're talking about is actually extraordinarily well-established. I'm interested in hearing about how we're going to take the extraordinarily well-established points and actually create leverage for change in how we're doing this. So I'm interested in hearing from the whole group, but certainly from our speakers on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed. Marie. Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped. Sorry. Ruth and then Marie. Sorry.
Yeah, Ruth Allen from CDA Collaborative Learning Projects. We do the evidence gathering around that kind of mentality and change that Ed's talking about. So this is kind of a follow-on to what Ed is saying is, you know, the science is well established, the arguments are well established. What is the evidence base that we would need to shift into action, and how might we focus that? So I'd be really interested in the panelists' answers to that. You know, what is the vexing question that we could really unite our community around to get over that hump into action?
And I'll take maybe just one more comment from Marie, and then I think people should also take a look at Joe's very good question in the chat box, but just in light of time, we might not have it. But Marie?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so great to see all of you after a long time. I just wanted to build on both what Elan said and what Sean said before. I really like, you know, Planet Aid has about 10 million people donating its used secondhand clothes and shoes to our boxes every year. That's an engagement. It saves the environment. It creates income for poor countries where we do farmers clubs and fight climate change as a part of that. But I really like the idea of Elan creating a forum that is, you know, on a sideline of UN and other government structures. But we also know, and that also speaks to what Sean was saying about uniting and not dividing ourselves. So what would a concrete agenda be for such a platform? And what should we do as a community? What should be the goals of this kind of platform? That was my question.
Thank you, Marie. And there's some really good points, again, in the chat box I would encourage people to look at. we don't have time to do justice to answering those questions, but maybe a minute each of you, Aneesa and Elan, and then I need to turn it back to Sam, who's going to wrap this up with some distilled key messages for all of us. No pressure. Aneesa.
Ed, I really liked your question, and I think that you're right. Like a lot of this is how do we have a just and intersectional recovery from COVID, you know? And I think that this is a big question that people have been kind of grappling with, even when they think about a Green New Deal, is intersectionality and equity, and what does it look like when historically marginalized communities are further marginalized by crisis, and how do we, you know, address that? I think that one part of addressing that is allowing them to lead the recovery process. I think that another part of that is, I think, like you're saying, right, like the IPCC is recognizing equity as this really important thing that we should be thinking about when creating policy. And I think that a just recovery kind of addresses that, because it's thinking about jobs, thinking about healthcare, it's thinking about so many different forms of welfare, it's thinking about, and I think that, like I've said before, climate change is really, really this umbrella that can bring together so many things and allow us to address crisis together and creatively, and from a lens of equity and justice.
Elan.
Yeah, I just want to respond to a couple of the points, and this is maybe more of a philosophical point about what mostly in regards to Ruth's question, which is the major divide in climate really is not between Democrats and Republicans, or conservative and liberal. It's an age gap. It's between older generations and younger generations, and it's because we don't have, at least in the Western civilized world, the same type of culture around generational equity. The way that particularly in indigenous communities in the United States, it's so well established as just a worldview. And so I think if we're talking about what is the wicked problem here, is that people are unable to view their actions as having a direct impact on the lives of future generations. And that, I think, is the core issue. It's not like, is solar energy cheaper than coal? It's, can we get people to internalize that what you do now has a damaging or beneficial impact on your grandchildren? And I think that's the kind of messaging that we need, and the kind of messengers that we need.
Thank you. Thank you both. I suspect Sam is going to thank you and ask for a warm round of applause. So let me turn it over to Sam, given the time. But thank you all.
Well, first, and thank you, Manish and Aneesa and Elan, for your time and your engagement, and all of you for joining, and hopefully this spurred your interest. I think the challenge before us is how to be more radical about inclusion, about the grassroots, the work that we do, to bring the expertise that we've brought in terms of inclusive forms of development into the work that we do on climate. The recognition that we're not the center of things here in many ways, but we need to join movements, and how we join those other movements will be critical. That the language we use and some of the bridging that we've been able to do in the development space might be helpful to address things broader on climate. And that we all have a lot of work to do as individual organizations to do this. And that requires the type of courage and type of leadership. And I love the way that we're sort of ending here. Ultimately, it's the world that I leave for my children, my children's children, and what do I do about that? And can I link that to my desire for social justice, for my desire to have more vulnerable populations addressed through programs, but to ensure that their voice is part of that solution. So we have a broad vision here, and it ties nicely into, for those of you who haven't joined the Compact, to please do and join it. For those of you that are engaged, please encourage your staff to stay engaged and so forth. We look to working with you, and the power of this collective is only because it's a collective. And so stick together and work with us. And again, Anish and Elan, we will meet you more than halfway. And thank you, Manish, for moderating us. And with that, let's give them all a round of applause. And thank you, and look forward to our next CEO gathering. And for those of you who are in the working groups, engage this way, and we'll take some of these learning going forward, and we'll see you next time. And stay safe.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Sam, for.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Aneesa. Thank you, Elan. That was fantastic.
Bye-bye.